The courtroom in Charleston's federal district was colder than it should have been. Not in temperature, but in temperament. Wood-paneled walls stretched high into silence, absorbing more than echoes. It was a place where careers rose, reputations died, and justice was supposed to mean something. But beneath the polished oak benches and buzzing fluorescence, truth often drowned under the weight of arrogance and legacy. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. At the center of that storm was Bradley Whitmore, a man whose legal presence could fill a room before he spoke. His reputation for legal brilliance was eclipsed only by his condescension, particularly toward those who didn't look like him. A legacy lawyer from a long line of Southern litigators, he wore privilege like a tailored suit, not tight, not loud, but unmistakable. His salt and pepper hair never shifted, even when his temper did. And that morning he stood before the jury with the confidence of a man certain of his place in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley began, his voice rich with performative indignation. "The prosecution wants you to believe this young man, this repeat offender, just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time again." He pointed toward a 21-year-old black defendant sitting beside his public defender. The boy's hands trembled under the table. His eyes darted around the room, landing nowhere. Bradley's voice dropped just enough to draw the jurors closer, as if they shared an inside joke at the expense of the accused. Near the back of the courtroom, the doors creaked open. Heads turned slightly, but most eyes returned quickly to the trial. Everyone, that is, except the clerk by the aisle, who noticed what others didn't. The man who had just entered wasn't lost, and he wasn't scared. He walked with purpose, not arrogance, and surveyed the courtroom, not as a visitor, but like someone who'd built it. He was black, mid-40s, tall, composed, wearing a dark three-piece suit with a subtle pinstripe that suggested custom tailoring, not department store purchase. His posture was straight, shoulders square, not stiff with pride but firm with practiced restraint. His son, no older than 10, followed behind him, holding a backpack and a thick worn book with gold lettering across its cover. Justice in America. No one recognized him. No one cared to. A few clerks exchanged glances, silently asking, "Why bring a child into federal court?" The man guided the boy to a seat in the back row and nodded politely at the bailiff. Then he sat hands folded, eyes sharp, observing. Bradley barely noticed. He was deep in theatrics now, spinning his narrative of distrust and plausible doubt. The young defendant's public defender had barely spoken all morning, drowned out by Bradley's commanding tone and his mastery over the room. The judge presiding, a weary older white man named Judge Holden, allowed it with minimal interruption. The unidentified black man shifted in his seat. A rustle. A whisper. Nothing disruptive, just enough to draw curious stares. The child leaned toward his father, whispering something only he could hear. The man smiled softly, reassuringly, as if to calm both his son and himself. 2 rows ahead, a young white paralegal nudged her colleague and muttered, "He better keep that kid quiet." It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. The subtle prejudice hummed through the walls like an old tune, familiar, unspoken, unchallenged. Bradley's voice grew louder, his theatrics more animated. "We are here to defend truth, not to coddle criminals. If we allow repeat offenders to manipulate the system." The black man raised a hand. At first, no one noticed. Then he stood. His movement wasn't abrupt. It wasn't aggressive. It was dignified. But in a courtroom where power was monopolized, even dignity felt like defiance. Judge Holden looked up, surprised. Bradley blinked, momentarily thrown off script. "Sir, this is a federal proceeding. You are not authorized to—" "I will speak," the man said, voice low but unwavering. The silence was immediate and thick, the kind of silence that doesn't come from quiet but from tension pulled tight like a wire, ready to snap. The judge's gavel hit the desk. "Sir, you are out of order." "No, Your Honor," the man replied without raising his voice, "but your court may be." Whispers erupted across the gallery. The bailiff, unsure whether to intervene, glanced nervously at Judge Holden. But the judge was frozen, eyes narrowing. Bradley scoffed, stepping forward with his usual self-importance. "Bailiff, remove this man at once. This is a serious trial, not some kind of—" The bailiff didn't move, because something was off. He'd seen that face before, the posture, the eyes. The courtroom doors opened again, and a second bailiff stepped in. This one younger, visibly shaken. He walked directly to the bench, whispered something into Judge Holden's ear. The judge's eyes widened. Everyone turned toward the man in the back of the room. The man said nothing. Bradley, confused, stepped back. "What's going on?" Then the older bailiff did what no one expected. He turned toward the man, clicked his heels slightly, and gave a subtle but unmistakable nod, the kind given only to superiors. The courtroom felt like it tilted. Judge Holden cleared his throat, now visibly pale. This man is not a visitor," the judge said, voice trembling slightly. He paused. The man in the pinstripe suit took a single step forward. Still calm, still composed. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. The boy looked up, proud and confused all at once. Then the man said evenly, "My name is Emerson Langston." Another pause. "I am the newly appointed federal judge of this district." Gasps, audible, uncontrolled gasps filled the courtroom like a flood breaking through old walls. Bradley's mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Holden slowly rose from his chair, not in objection but in recognition. Emerson Langston, still standing at the back, adjusted his tie. His eyes scanned every face in that courtroom, especially the ones that had dismissed him only minutes earlier. Especially Bradley. The tension was unbearable. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. "I came to observe this proceeding," Emerson said, voice rising slightly now, "to witness firsthand the culture of this courtroom, and I have seen enough." Then he took a final step forward. The room was silent, until he added, "I will be presiding over the remainder of this trial." And as the courtroom sat stunned, Bradley turned white as paper, because he remembered exactly who Emerson Langston was and what he had done to him years ago. The moment hung in the air like a suspended breath, thick, suffocating, ready to collapse under its own weight. Emerson Langston, tall and still, stood only a few feet from the bench, his voice just having declared that he, not Judge Holden, would be presiding over the courtroom's proceedings. And yet, it wasn't just the words that shifted the energy in the room, it was the audacity of who spoke them. A black man, in a courtroom steeped in centuries of whiteness and silent rules. A black man who'd walked in quietly, had sat in the back row, and now threatened to reframe everything. Bradley Whitmore didn't just hear the words, he felt them as an insult. The pressure of being upstaged, the shock of being undermined, and the latent racism he'd nursed all his life, flared like gasoline hitting open flame. His voice boomed, louder than it needed to be. "Absolutely not," he bellowed. "This is a federal court. I will not tolerate this disruption from a man who thinks walking in here and making declarations makes him a judge." He pointed accusingly, as though Emerson were a child caught sneaking into a grown man's world. "You don't get to announce you're in charge, sir. There is protocol, there is law, and there is order." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some jurors looked to the existing judge for direction. Others simply stared, too stunned by Bradley's boldness or blind ignorance to process what was unfolding. Judge Holden remained seated, lips pressed in a tight, almost embarrassed line. He didn't correct Bradley, didn't interrupt. Maybe he was afraid. Or maybe he was complicit, letting things unravel just to see where they might land. The young black boy, Emerson's son, looked up at his father, his expression tight with confusion, maybe even shame. Emerson, still calm, placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder again. That simple touch said more than any raised voice ever could. "Stay still, stay strong. We are not the ones causing chaos." Bradley wasn't done. "Security," he barked. "Remove this man from the courtroom immediately. I don't care who he says he is. You don't get to hijack a courtroom because you walk in wearing a suit and speak well." The words echoed, ugly, twisted in implication. "Speak well," someone near the back repeated in a whisper, disgust and disbelief entwined. "Disrespectful. Embarrassing." Whispers turned to murmurs, a rising chorus of discomfort, but Emerson didn't react. His silence felt heavier than any outburst could have. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond with fire. His stillness was deliberate, weaponized dignity in a room that didn't know how to handle it. The older bailiff stepped forward, finally breaking the moment. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "I strongly advise you to lower your voice." Bradley's face contorted into disbelief. "You advise me?" "I'm not finished," the bailiff interrupted, more firmly now. "You are making a scene in front of a sitting federal judge." Bradley laughed, short and sharp, disbelief spilling into mockery. "What federal judge? You mean this man?" He pointed again. "Where's his credentials? Where's the robe? Where's the announcement? We didn't receive any." And then the younger bailiff burst through the side door. He was breathless, clearly having run from somewhere deeper in the courthouse. In his hand was a printed memo, the one that had been distributed the previous week, apparently unread or ignored by half the staff. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked over to the judge's bench, handed the memo to Judge Holden, then turned toward Emerson and snapped to a salute. The courtroom gasped. The salute wasn't theatrical. It wasn't exaggerated. It was precise, military-like, delivered with the kind of deference that didn't come from fear, but from respect. Bradley's mouth fell open. The courtroom's collective breath caught. The whispering stopped instantly. All sound was replaced by a thundering silence. Judge Holden finally rose from his chair, now visibly ashamed. The Honorable Emerson Langston was confirmed by the Senate last month. His appointment became active as of this Monday. He is in fact the presiding judge of this district, as assigned by the federal rotation, Holden said stiffly. I was merely handling transition duties until he was ready to assume command. Bradley stumbled backward slightly, as if the words physically struck him. His mind was racing, frantically searching for some reality in which this was a mistake, some technicality he could latch onto. But there was none. The truth had arrived, and it was wearing the face of a man he had belittled. Emerson stepped forward. For the first time since entering, he addressed the court with authority. Mr. Whitmore, he said, voice smooth but steely. I gave this court the opportunity to carry on without interruption. I allowed the proceedings to continue, even as I witnessed conduct that would make any room of justice flinch. Bradley's jaw clenched. I didn't speak, Emerson continued, when I watched a young man, a defendant, not a threat, be humiliated in front of a jury. I didn't speak when I saw how quickly you, a respected attorney, reduced a courtroom to a stage for your personal ego. And I didn't speak when you assumed that the color of my skin meant I didn't belong here. The room was utterly still. Even the ceiling fans seemed to pause. I speak now, Emerson said, not just as a judge, but as a man who has sat in the chairs you refuse to acknowledge, as a father who walked into this room hoping my son would witness justice and saw something far less. Bradley finally spoke. His voice cracked. I wasn't informed. You were informed. You just didn't read it, Emerson said coolly. Or you didn't care. Either way, your reaction today was not one of ignorance. It was one of entitlement. The jurors looked uncomfortable now, shifting in their chairs, eyes cast downward. I will now assume control of this courtroom, Emerson declared. All proceedings are paused until further review of conduct and decorum violations. He turned to the older bailiff. Clear the room. I want counsel only. Everyone else, jurors, visitors, dismissed until further notice. As people stood and began to leave, murmuring in stunned whispers, Bradley remained frozen. He watched as the boy beside Emerson rose, picked up his backpack, and stood proudly beside his father. Emerson looked down at his son and nodded. The boy smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. And just as the courtroom emptied, a voice called out from the hallway, "There's something you both need to see. It's about a case from 10 years ago, and it involves both of you." The courtroom emptied slowly, reluctantly, like air escaping a room that had been sealed too long. The buzz outside the double doors had already begun, whispers turning into speculation, speculation into rumor. But inside, behind the closed doors, the tension remained, thick as smoke and twice as suffocating. Bradley Whitmore hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had exploded minutes earlier, his mouth slightly open, his thoughts spiraling. He'd been silenced, not by force but by truth, and worse than the embarrassment, worse than the shattered confidence, was the deeper realization that this wasn't just about legal power. This was about exposure. He hadn't just disrespected a judge. He had disrespected Emerson Langston. The name was now echoing in his skull with brutal clarity. He knew that name. It had been in the news recently, whispered in legal circles, plastered briefly across the screens in the firm's break room. A black federal judge appointed to the Charleston district. A progressive nomination. A controversial one. A quiet storm. But Bradley hadn't cared enough to pay attention. Because to him, it hadn't mattered. The man who now stood before him, flanked by bailiffs and still radiating calm authority, had been in the background of his ignorance all along, and that reality felt heavier than any reprimand. Judge Emerson Langston didn't look at Bradley, not directly, not yet. He stood near the bench now, allowing his presence to fill the space instead of his voice. Every move was deliberate, every silence was louder than Bradley's earlier outburst. His son, the young boy with the worn law book, remained at his side. The boy held the book tightly against his chest, the edges frayed from years of use. On its spine, barely visible now, were the faded words, Langston, 1989 edition. That book had a story. So did the man who wrote it. A junior clerk, who had returned to the courtroom after the clearing, looked at the book and blinked. "Wait, Langston?" she whispered to her colleague. "That book, he wrote it? I thought that was like an academic. That's him, the colleague said under his breath. Federal judge and author, Jesus. Bradley heard the whispers. They didn't make it easier. They made it worse. His ignorance wasn't just being revealed, it was being dissected in real time. Emerson finally turned toward him. I see the confusion in your eyes, Mr. Whitmore, he said, calm but clipped. So allow me to clarify, not for your benefit, but for the record. He took a breath. I am Judge Emerson Langston, appointed to the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina. My appointment was confirmed unanimously. The official transition began this past Monday. You were notified by memo and email, both of which you ignored. The words weren't cruel. They were factual. But in that courtroom, facts hurt more than insults. Your conduct earlier wasn't just disrespectful. It was revelatory. It revealed how quickly one assumes authority belongs to a certain look, a certain voice, a certain color. Bradley swallowed hard. He wanted to object, wanted to defend himself. But every response felt hollow. Had I entered this room as a white man in a similar suit, I doubt you would have shouted me down, Emerson continued. You wouldn't have summoned security. You would have asked a question, clarified. You would have listened. He looked to his son. My presence here wasn't just about assuming judicial duties. It was about something else, something more personal. Bradley's brows furrowed. This wasn't in the memo. 10 years ago, Emerson said slowly, turning back to the court. I sat in this very room, not as a judge, not even as an attorney. I sat on that bench, he pointed to the gallery's back row, watching a trial unfold that would shape the rest of my career. A young black defendant, a lazy defense, a ruthless prosecutor. He paused. And that prosecutor was you. Bradley's knees nearly buckled. A flash of memory hit like lightning. A decade ago, the State versus Terrence Briggs case. A petty theft blown into a felony by procedural manipulation. A teenager railroaded into a 5-year sentence. A public defender too overwhelmed to fight back. And an ambitious Bradley Whitmore seizing the moment to look tough on crime. Emerson had been there. Watching. Terrence Briggs never had a chance, Emerson said, voice low but firm. I was a clerk then, powerless, but I swore that day I would rise high enough to make sure boys like him were never crushed by the system again. His son gripped the law book tighter. Bradley's voice, when it came, was weak. I was just doing my job. The evidence, Emerson interrupted sharply, was circumstantial and biased. A police report filled with inconsistencies, a witness statement coerced, and you knew it. You built your argument on silence, the kind that surrounds poor black boys when no one is watching. Bradley had nothing left to say. Emerson took a step forward. But I was watching. I watched then. I'm watching now. The courtroom was completely still. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. Emerson scanned the room again. His eyes didn't seek applause. They didn't seek validation. They sought reckoning. Racism, he had long understood, wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was buried in casual dismissals, in forgotten memos, in assumptions about who could and could not lead. Today, he hadn't just entered the courtroom as a judge. He had entered as a mirror, and what it reflected was ugly. My role here is not to punish you, Mr. Whitmore, he said at last. Not yet. My role is to ensure that justice, real justice, is no longer defined by who yells loudest or wears the whitest robe. He turned back toward the bench. His son followed him to the judge's seat. Emerson paused before sitting, then opened the law book his son carried. Inside on the first page was a dedication in gold ink, to my future, who must never inherit my silence. He sat down, and for the first time that morning, the courtroom truly felt like a courtroom. But just before Emerson could address the next item, the courtroom door swung open again. A woman in a crisp suit stepped inside, holding a manila folder. Judge Langston, she said urgently, there's a sealed case file you need to see, one connected to Whitmore, and it's from your past. For a long moment, the folder remained untouched on the bench. Its plain manila cover seemed ordinary, almost unimportant, but its presence had chilled the room like a sudden draft. The assistant who delivered it stood respectfully to the side, gaze lowered, as if she too understood that what was inside wasn't meant for just any judge. It was meant for him. Emerson Langston looked down at it, not with fear, but with the quiet awareness of a man who had been here before, not in title, but in trial. He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he adjusted the sleeves of his robe slightly, sat straighter, and rested his eyes on the room in front of him. I know what you're thinking, Emerson said finally, his voice calm, steady. You're wondering how a man like me, who carries this title, who sits in this seat, could possibly understand what it means to be treated as less than. After all, isn't this robe supposed to erase the doubt? A few heads lifted, eyes met his. No one dared respond. But this robe, he continued, brushing a hand across the fabric, doesn't protect me from being profiled. It doesn't silence the assumptions whispered when I walk into a courtroom unannounced. It doesn't rewrite the moments when I've been mistaken, misjudged, and dismissed. Not because of who I am, but because of what I look like. He turned slightly, as if addressing a wider audience than the people in front of him.
When I passed the bar, I thought everything would change. I believed the credentials, the degrees, the accolades, they would be enough. That once I wore the suit and carried the briefcase, the world would finally see me as I saw myself.
A pause. But that's not how it worked. He leaned back, and the years seemed to settle on his shoulders all at once. I was 27 when I walked into a courtroom in Montgomery for my first major case. Nervous, eager, sharp, I had prepped for weeks. Every document, every motion, every line of argument memorized. I arrived early, as always, took my seat at the defense table. His gaze darkened, not in anger, but in memory. The bailiff came over, looked me up and down, and said, "Defendants sit on the other side." A silence fell again. I told him I was the attorney. He laughed, genuinely, like it was the funniest thing he'd heard that week. He told me, and I quote, "That's cute, son. The public defender's late. You just sit tight." No one moved. I waited. I said nothing. When the judge arrived, I stood, introduced myself as counsel for the defendant. The courtroom went silent. The judge blinked like he didn't believe me. The opposing counsel, a white man no older than me, smirked and said, "Are we letting interns argue cases now?" Bradley's eyes lowered. "I won that case," Emerson said, but no one clapped. No one congratulated me afterward. I walked out of that room carrying a victory no one else wanted to acknowledge. He took a deep breath, his fingers now resting gently atop the sealed folder. I thought that was a one-time thing. It wasn't. It happened again, and again, in courthouses, in police stations, even at airport terminals. I've been mistaken for the defendant, the translator, the security guard. Once during a federal trial, a clerk asked if I was there to fix the projector. A slight murmur rippled across the room. "That's the weight we carry," he said, "even with this robe on." His son, seated behind him, looked at his father with a reverence deeper than admiration. It was understanding. Emerson had always spoken of justice, of perseverance. But now, for the first time, the boy saw the burden that came with it. Emerson stood up slowly. He stepped away from the bench, down onto the courtroom floor, and paused in the very spot where Bradley had shouted only minutes ago. "This is where it happens," he said softly. "Where men like me are told to be quiet. Where our volume is measured as aggression. Where our intelligence is second-guessed, our presence questioned." He turned to face the bench again, the robe moving slightly with his motion. "And yet we keep coming back, not for glory, not for revenge, but because we know that if we don't sit in these chairs, someone else will, and they might not care what justice really looks like." He reached for the collar of his robe and slowly began to unfasten it. The courtroom held its breath. As the robe slipped from his shoulders, what remained wasn't just a man in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. It was a man bearing a scar, just visible beneath the edge of his collarbone. It ran diagonally across the upper left side of his chest. Faded now but unmistakable, a mark of something violent, something personal. Gasps were stifled. "I don't show this often," Emerson said, voice even but thick with memory, "but you should know what justice costs." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. That scar wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't the result of some courtroom battle. It was a wound, a literal reminder of what it meant to exist in this country in black skin, even with a law degree, even with a bench to sit on. He refastened the robe, adjusted the collar, walked back up to the bench with the same poise he had when he entered the room hours earlier. Then he finally touched the manila folder, cracked it open. Inside were a few documents, some yellowed with age, others crisp and recent. A court summary, an affidavit, and a single photograph. He looked at the image, his brow furrowed, ever so slightly. "Bradley Whitmore," he said, looking up again. "I believe we need to discuss the case of Reed v. State of South Carolina, 2005. Bradley's face paled instantly.
"I wasn't the lead,"
he began, but Emerson cut him off with a raised hand. "You were listed as co-counsel on the case that overturned evidence in a civil rights complaint involving coerced confessions." "I was barely involved," Bradley muttered. "The plaintiff was a young black man named Charles Reed," Emerson continued, flipping through the pages. He claimed he was beaten during interrogation. His claims were dismissed. He lost everything. You were one of the attorneys who filed a motion to suppress the hospital records that could have proved his injuries. Bradley looked like he'd been hit in the chest. Emerson held up the photograph. It was grainy, taken from an old report. A younger man, bruised across the face, staring blankly at the camera. There was no blood, but the damage was deep, embedded. This, Emerson said, holding up the photo, is why I came here quietly. This is why I brought my son, because I needed him to see how history can be buried, and how we must unearth it, no matter how much time has passed. He placed the photograph on the bench, where it sat like evidence in a trial that had never truly ended.
Then Emerson looked up, eyes sharp, voice low.
And Charles Reed was my cousin. The courtroom, still partially emptied, pulsed with a new energy, one neither built by tradition nor law but by exposure, the kind of exposure that doesn't just damage reputation, but dismantles the illusion of power. Emerson Langston had not raised his voice. He had not punished. Yet Bradley Whitmore sat in the front like a child chastened, his spine no longer straight, his breath shallow. The robe Emerson wore may have commanded attention, but it was his restraint, his measured calm that delivered the most cutting blow. Charles Reed. The name swam in Bradley's mind, disoriented and tangled in memory. He hadn't heard that name in over 15 years. Yet now it rang with fresh clarity. A courtroom, a battered man, medical records that never saw daylight. Bradley tried to speak, but the words faltered before they reached air. The veneer of confidence he had worn for decades, the casual smirk, the sharp tone, the raised eyebrow of entitlement, had all faded into a mask of panic. I, Judge Langston, he started, standing slowly. I want to clarify. You want to clarify? Emerson's voice interrupted softly. Or you want to control the narrative again? It wasn't a challenge. It was a question posed with surgical precision, the kind that cuts deeper because it leaves no room for escape. I didn't know he was your cousin, Bradley stammered. That's not the problem, Emerson said, flipping through the remaining pages in the folder. The problem is you knew he was black, and you treated his case like it didn't matter. You knew he was injured, and you buried evidence to protect a narrative. You may have forgotten his name, but your actions made sure he never forgot yours. There was no shouting, no slamming of the gavel, just truth, raw, quiet damning. Bradley glanced around the room, as if searching for an ally, but the faces that met his gaze were no longer impressed, no longer reverent. They were studying him now, with distance, with suspicion. The paralegal he'd mocked earlier looked away, her jaw tight. A fellow attorney, a junior partner from his firm, typed silently into her phone, not even bothering to hide it. And the jury. Even though they'd been dismissed, several had lingered at the side entrance, peeking through the windowed door, drawn back by the shifting tide. Their expressions were no longer neutral. They looked like people who had watched the curtain pull back on a man they once thought heroic, and discovered something hollow beneath. Bradley's voice cracked again. It was standard legal strategy. Say that again, Emerson said without looking up. Bradley hesitated. Say it was standard, Emerson repeated, so we can all hear it plainly. That silencing a man's injuries was just part of the game. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emerson finally placed the folder down, closing it gently. Then he rose again, not with anger, but with the sorrow of a man who had waited too long to see the wheel of justice turn in his favor, only to realize that even justice comes at the cost of dignity. You see, Mr. Whitmore, Emerson continued, the law never truly scared men like you, but exposure does, because you built your success not just on knowledge of the law, but on the assumption that no one would question how you used it. Flashbacks played like ghosts behind Bradley's eyes. A young black woman weeping quietly in his office after being pressured into a plea deal. An undocumented teen trembling through a mistranslated deposition he refused to slow down for. A janitor whose testimony he once mocked in open court for using the word ain't. It wasn't that Bradley had forgotten. He had just never needed to remember. Because no one made him. Until now. His eyes burned, not from shame, from exposure. I did what I thought was best for my clients, he muttered. You mean your white clients, Emerson corrected softly. Bradley looked down at his hands, hands that had once pointed in accusation, typed legal briefings with the confidence of someone untouchable. They trembled now, as if the power had finally drained from his fingertips. Then came the twist. From the corner of the room, a voice spoke up, soft but confident. If the court permits, I have something that might add clarity to Mr. Whitmore's standard strategies. All eyes turned. It was a black clerk, a woman in her early 30s, smartly dressed, posture straight as steel. Her badge read Danielle Marks, and her presence, until now, had blended into the procedural hum of the courtroom. But now her voice carried something else: history. Emerson raised an eyebrow. Proceed. Danielle stepped forward, pulling a flash drive from her pocket. I worked as an intern at Whitmore and Blake LLP for a summer during law school, she said. It was unremarkable, except for the fact that I found something in the firm's case archive folders, something I saved and kept. Bradley froze. Danielle walked to the clerk's station and handed over the drive. It was quickly inserted, and a file titled Read Discussion 2005 Wave blinked onto the screen. I couldn't believe what I heard back then, she said. So I kept it, because I knew, someday, someone might need to. Emerson nodded to the bailiff. Play it. The courtroom filled with static, then voices, young, confident, familiar. Bradley's voice. Laughing. Honestly, the guy looked like he got jumped, but hell, if we suppress the hospital records, we kill the sympathy card. No bruises, no bias. Another voice chimed in, a colleague, chuckling. Damn, Brad, you ruthless. Bradley's voice again. Look, the kid's probably guilty of something. I'm not gonna let a little black eye screw our momentum. Let the public defenders play savior on someone else's dime. The recording stopped. Bradley didn't even look up. His face was blank, not from lack of emotion, but because there were too many to show. Disgust rippled across the courtroom, audibly. Danielle stood tall. That was your voice, Mr. Whitmore, and that was Charles Reed's life. No one clapped. No one cheered. It was too painful for celebration. Emerson inhaled deeply, absorbing the weight of the moment, not as a judge but as a cousin, as a father, as a black man in America who knew too well that silence is often the loudest injustice. Then from the doorway, another voice emerged, deeper, older. Judge Langston, the man said, stepping into view. My name is Malcolm Briggs. I think you'll want to hear what my brother tried to tell you 10 years ago, before Whitmore made sure he never got the chance. The air in the courtroom grew tense again, but now it vibrated with something heavier than confrontation. Revelation. The voice that had just stepped through the doors carried not just urgency, but history. Malcolm Briggs, tall, lean, with a presence weathered by time and battle, stood at the threshold like a man who'd waited his entire life for the truth to have its turn. Judge Emerson Langston looked up slowly, his gaze fixing on the man with measured intensity. He didn't speak right away. There was something about Malcolm's tone, not the words but the pain underneath them, that told him this moment wasn't just procedural, it was personal. Again. Malcolm Briggs, Emerson repeated. Who was your brother? Malcolm stepped forward, his voice steady but raw. Terrence Briggs. He died 5 years ago. But before that, he spent half his life trying to recover from the case your courtroom just dismissed this morning. A hush fell. Even those who had heard the name earlier in Emerson's opening remarks now felt the name tighten the room. Terrence Briggs. The young black man railroaded by a corrupt prosecution, discarded by the system, and ignored until his final breath. Emerson stood slowly. Come forward. Malcolm walked with the poise of someone who didn't expect justice but demanded it anyway. From inside his coat, he pulled a small, dust-covered cassette tape, something so out of time it looked more like a relic than evidence. He held it up with a trembling hand. This was recorded the week before Terrence was sentenced, he said. He gave it to me. Told me to keep it if something ever happened to him. Told me it wouldn't matter right away. But one day, when someone finally listened, this would. Danielle, the clerk who had just dropped the damning flash drive minutes earlier, stepped forward and took the tape gently. Her eyes met Malcolm's, and in them a silent understanding passed. Judge Langston nodded toward the technical clerk. Digitize it. Play it. While the tape was transferred into the system, no one moved. Even Bradley, now slumped in a seat by the defense table, said nothing. His face was chalk white, his eyes hollow. He knew this wasn't over. And he knew it was no longer just about arrogance. This was about a legacy unraveling. The file loaded. A hiss. Then Terrence's voice, young, afraid, but resolute. If you're hearing this, he said on the tape, then I've probably already lost. I'm not here to beg. I just want someone to know what happened. Emerson's hands tightened around the edge of the bench. They told me if I didn't sign the plea deal, they'd find more charges. The voice continued. They said the DA was real focused on results, and that if I didn't cooperate, they'd pin me as violent. I didn't touch anyone, but they didn't care. They had a narrative. Terrence's voice cracked. The lawyer I got, he said he couldn't help me. Said Whitmore plays rough. That's the phrase he used. Whitmore plays rough. The entire courtroom was still. Even the walls seemed to lean in. I overheard them once, Terrence's voice said. Late, Whitmore and some other guy laughing, saying how they'd tighten the chains and make sure the jury saw me as dangerous. Said these types never get second chances anyway. Danielle, standing just feet from the playback device, turned slightly, her eyes damp, but her stance firm. I just wanted to finish school, the voice said softly. But they didn't care, so I'm saying this now, because if anyone ever listens, I hope you use this to stop him, even if I can't. The tape clicked. Silence. And then the courtroom exploded. Not in sound, but in emotion. Gasps, muffled sobs, the kind of collective shock that comes when the invisible is finally made visible. Decades of questions, suspicions, and dismissals now stood naked under a spotlight. Judge Langston didn't look at anyone. He stared straight ahead, face blank, not from indifference, but from the emotional paralysis that comes when someone else's pain mirrors your own. He stood slowly. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. This courtroom is now sealed, he said, his tone sharp and clear. No recordings, no transcripts. Bailiff, close the doors. Remove all unauthorized personnel. The bailiffs moved quickly, locking the doors and stepping into position. Bradley looked up, blinking like a man waking from a coma. Wait, this wasn't part of the… Emerson cut him off. This was always part of it, he said. You just assumed your past would never find a microphone. A low rustle passed through the attorneys present, even those unaffiliated with the case. Emerson wasn't just dealing with misconduct. He was pulling the thread on a possible pattern of systemic racial bias hidden behind legal maneuvering. And now the world, or at least this courtroom, was watching it all unravel in real time. Malcolm Briggs remained near the bench, unmoved. He recorded that knowing no one would believe him, he said. But he hoped someone might. That someone would care enough to listen. Emerson nodded once. The kind of nod that acknowledges not just fact but grief. He then turned toward the clerk. Notify the U.S. Attorney's Office. Effective immediately. I am ordering an emergency ethics review of all cases where Mr. Whitmore acted as lead or co-counsel, involving minority defendants between 2000 and 2020. Gasps again, this time sharper. That was hundreds of cases. Maybe more. Bradley's voice cracked. You can't… I can, Emerson interrupted. And I will. The robe no longer looked ceremonial. It looked like armor. Emerson continued. We will conduct a full audit of suppressed evidence, plea negotiations, sentencing disparities, and courtroom conduct. Every case, every client, every document. Bradley slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. Outside, unseen but felt, the media storm had already begun. Word of the sealed courtroom. The audio, the tape, it would leak. It always did. And when it did, the story wouldn't just be about Bradley Whitmore. It would be about how racism doesn't die. It just adapts, dressed in suits, hidden in legalese, tucked into footnotes and motions. And today, that adaptation met its reckoning. Judge Langston looked up, meeting every eye in the room. This is no longer just a trial, he said quietly. This is now a federal hearing. Effective immediately, we reconvene with representation from the Department of Justice. And this courtroom, this very room, will be where we start rewriting the rules. The doors of the federal courthouse didn't creak open that afternoon. They burst, not physically, but symbolically, under the weight of truth that could no longer be contained. By the time Judge Emerson Langston recessed the emergency hearing and stepped back into his chambers, the world outside had already shifted. What began as a simple interruption had detonated into a full-scale reckoning. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps. Microphones bristled in clusters like antennas searching for the signal of truth. Journalists shouted questions toward the marble entryway, fighting to capture any comment, any facial twitch, any hint of what had happened behind the suddenly sealed courtroom doors. Is it true Judge Langston launched an ethics investigation? Did Bradley Whitmore suppress evidence in civil rights cases? Was that recording real? No one answered. Not yet. Inside, Emerson sat in a small, quiet antechamber off his private chambers. His robe folded neatly beside him. His son seated close, drawing circles on the corner of his notepad, the same one he'd brought into court. The boy hadn't said much. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, though, it wasn't confusion. It was awakening. He had seen something sacred and something shattered all in one day. A knock came at the door. It was his clerk. Sir, there's a growing crowd outside. How big? Emerson asked. Big enough that city officials have sent traffic patrol. Protesters, media, students, former clients, it's all happening. Emerson nodded slowly. Tell them I'm unavailable for comment. Yes, Your Honor. He turned to his son. Let them shout, he said softly. The truth doesn't need a microphone when it finally speaks for itself. By dusk, the the courthouse plaza had transformed into something resembling a historical scene. Part protest, part press conference, part public grief. Cardboard signs waved in the air. Justice for Terrence. How many did he silence? End legal lynching. Reporters scrambled between crowd members, catching interviews with former defendants, black attorneys, even retired clerks who had worked alongside Whitmore but said they knew something was off for years. Bradley's name was everywhere, but not as he once knew it. News crawlers flashed across national networks. Federal judge uncovers racial bias in decades of legal cases. Attorney Bradley Whitmore, under investigation for suppression, misconduct. Justice in the spotlight. Emerson Langston's first week stuns the nation. At Whitmore and Blake LLP, silence reigned in the boardroom. The senior partners sat stone-faced as emails flooded in. Journalists requesting comment, clients threatening to pull contracts, even former interns speaking out on social media about what they had witnessed. The firm released a brief statement. Effective immediately, Attorney Bradley Whitmore has been placed on indefinite leave pending internal review. We take these allegations seriously and are cooperating fully with federal authorities. But internally, it was worse. Whitmore was no longer an asset. He was a liability, one they couldn't afford to defend. He was finished. From Charleston to Chicago to D.C. and beyond, the public began to piece together a mosaic that had until now existed only in fragments. How black defendants, especially young men, had been disproportionately convicted under a pattern of strategic silence. Plea deals pushed under pressure, medical reports suppressed, language used in court designed to provoke bias. And now, the silence was breaking. Former clients began to speak out. Men who had been told take the deal or face worse now recounted courtroom exchanges they hadn't fully understood at the time. Families remembered how cold Bradley had seemed, how little interest he had shown in understanding the lives he was litigating. I never knew my son's injuries were documented, one mother told a reporter outside the courthouse. Bradley said the photos were irrelevant. Now I know they were inconvenient. Social media ignited. The hashtag blindfolded justice trended nationally, tied to images of Emerson standing at the bench, eyes forward, voice calm, truth weaponized. Some asked, why now? Others responded, why did it take this long? Inside Emerson's chambers, he read quietly through the initial reports being compiled by the DOJ liaison. Names, case numbers, annotations, all connected to Whitmore. He felt no satisfaction. Only Wade. He looked across the table to Malcolm Briggs, who now sat quietly, his hands folded, eyes distant. Terrence believed in people, Malcolm said, even when they didn't believe in him. He recorded that tape, thinking maybe someone like you would come along. Emerson nodded. I just wish it hadn't taken this long. Malcolm glanced toward the window, where the lights from the protest shimmered like a vigil. Long isn't the problem. Silent is. Those words stayed with Emerson. Just then, his phone vibrated. A notification. It was from an investigative journalist, someone local but sharp, Naomi Presley, known for tenacious reporting on race and law. The message read, Judge Langston, you need to see this. I pulled court logs from '06. There's a sealed case that doesn't match the docket. Whitmore's name is on it, but the plaintiff name is redacted. I think he buried a case entirely. Meet me ASAP. Emerson stared at the screen. His son looked up. Everything okay? He smiled faintly. No, but it's finally becoming honest. He stood, took his coat, and nodded to his clerk. Cancel my evening meetings, and prepare the court for one more review session tomorrow. His voice was calm, but the edge had returned. Because if Naomi was right, if Bradley had not only manipulated justice but erased it, then what came next wouldn't be exposure. It would be reckoning. Emerson sat alone in his chambers long after the lights outside had dimmed and the plaza began to empty. The day's revelations still rang in the walls, not just the audio tapes, the sealed files, the national attention, but something deeper. It wasn't the headlines that lingered, it was the silence afterward. That moment when the world stops screaming, and all that's left is memory. He glanced at the leather-bound journal he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk. Faded, frayed, its pages worn thin. He hadn't opened it in years, not since before the appointment. But tonight, it called to him like an old friend, or a wound. He opened to the first page. And suddenly, he was 8 years old again. The streets of Orangeburg, South Carolina in the 1970s were quiet, sun-beaten, and split down the middle, not by traffic but by color. Emerson remembered riding his rusted blue bicycle past the corner drugstore, slowing every time he passed the faded whites only sign still barely visible on the brick wall. The law had changed, the culture hadn't. His mother, Grace Langston, was a seamstress, quiet, brilliant and fierce in ways that never made the newspaper. She didn't march, she didn't shout, but every stitch she wove into the clothes of local judges and doctors came with a prayer whispered for her son. Let the thread hold longer than the hate. She raised him on stories of survival, of stolen dignity, of strength pressed into silence. Emerson had listened, but more than that he watched. He watched her correct white customers with polite but firm grammar, watched her demand payment with the poise of a woman who refused to be looked down on. His father had died young, complications the doctors had ignored until it was too late. Grace never said it out loud, but Emerson understood. His father didn't die of illness, he died of neglect, and that reality followed him to school, where his curiosity often earned suspicion. When Emerson aced his spelling test in 3rd grade, his teacher accused him of cheating. You couldn't have gotten all these right, she had said with narrowed eyes. Boys like you don't get scores like this. He had said nothing. But that day, something changed. By 15, Emerson was reading criminal law texts from the local library, not out of ambition, but because he needed to understand how they made the rules. Every arrest on the news, every whisper about those kinds of kids, felt like a message aimed directly at him. When he won a debate competition at 16, the mayor of Orangeburg refused to shake his hand. When he got his acceptance letter to Howard University, it was stuffed in the bottom of the school secretary's outbox, delayed accidentally by over a week. But still, he went. Howard opened Emerson's world in ways both liberating and brutal. He walked among other black scholars for the first time, shared ideas that weren't immediately dismissed, spoke in classrooms where he wasn't the only one in the room who looked like him. And yet even there, the ghost of racism followed. During his internship in D.C., while shadowing court proceedings, he was stopped and searched 3 times in 1 week entering the same courthouse. When he finally passed the LSAT and enrolled in Georgetown Law, he found himself invisible in the lecture halls once again. One professor revered by his peers once told Emerson during a mock trial, "Your argument was good, but too passionate. Judges won't take kindly to a tone that sounds defensive." He had smiled politely, then rewritten the argument twice as sharp. His first real courtroom battle came in a small civil case, representing a family evicted during the winter. The landlord had falsified documents. Emerson proved it. He'd never forget the judge's final comment, after ruling in their favor. "You should consider practicing in more modest districts. Bigger courtrooms may not be ready for you." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. Years passed. He built a quiet but respected career in civil rights litigation. Emerson knew that the spotlight could be dangerous, especially for a black man who didn't play into expectations. He didn't smile when he didn't want to, didn't bend when others needed comfort, and because of that he was often labeled cold, stern, hard to read. But his clients, mostly poor, mostly black, knew. They saw the fire in his stillness. The kind of man who read every line in their paperwork because he knew those lines had once caged men like his father. His name slowly gained traction. Then, one day, a nomination came. At first he thought it was a mistake, a political move, a hollow gesture to silence diversity critiques. But when the confirmation finally came through, and his son looked up at him wide-eyed, holding a toy gavel in his tiny hands, Emerson knew it wasn't about belief. It was about responsibility. Now, sitting in his chambers, the memory that lingered most was not a win, but a loss. He turned to the back of the journal. A name written in dark ink, underlined twice. Jasmine Miles. She was his first major criminal defense case. 19 years old. Wrongfully accused of shoplifting. Detained overnight. Then charged with resisting arrest after pushing an officer's hand away from her hair. Her court-appointed lawyer had dumped the case on Emerson's desk, saying, "She's got attitude. Good luck." He had tried, fought hard, argued better than the lead prosecutor. But the jury saw a young black girl, with fire in her voice, not truth in her story. She lost. Emerson remembered walking her to the holding cell after sentencing, offering her a kind word. She had smiled through tears and said, "Don't feel bad. They never wanted to hear me, but I know you did." She'd served 9 months. He never forgot. He closed the journal now. His son knocked gently at the door. "They're saying more people are showing up outside." Emerson nodded. He stood, walked to the mirror across the room, and stared at himself, not in pride but in reflection. The robe draped over the chair, the weight on his shoulders, the truth in his blood. "Being a judge," he whispered, "doesn't mean the fight ends." He picked up the robe, placed it back over his shoulders, and fastened the clasp near his collar. Then turned to his son. "Come," he said. "There's something we need to fix." The boy followed him to the door. Emerson paused. then added. And it starts with a case that should have never been closed. Jasmine Miles. Emerson had always believed the law could be a scalpel. Precise, deliberate, capable of cutting away rot without destroying the whole. But standing in his chambers now, robe draped across his shoulders, with the name Jasmine Miles heavy on his tongue and memory, he realized some wounds were never clean. Some had to be ripped open to be healed. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done reopening old scars. As he stepped into the hallway with his son beside him, his clerk approached, holding a phone. "Judge Langston," she said, voice low. "Naomi Presley just left a voicemail. She found something else, something about the Terrence Briggs case, says it's urgent." Emerson's eyes narrowed. That case, the one that had first pulled him into court as an assistant counsel, green and idealistic, had always haunted him. He remembered the boy's face, the soft-spoken words, the way his mother gripped his arm during closing arguments like she was holding on to the last branch above a flood. He took the phone and listened. Naomi's voice crackled through the speaker. "Judge Langston, I just pulled docket logs from 2004. The Terrence Briggs case has a secondary file entry sealed. Not suppressed, not dismissed, buried. It's not indexed in the state database. But there's an evidence transfer form that lists a full set of surveillance footage never shown in court. It was labeled unusable. That footage may show Briggs was never even inside the store he was accused of robbing." A pause. And Bradley Whitmore filed the motion to seal it, personally. Emerson felt something shift in his chest. Not rage. Not yet. Just the familiar icy tightness that came with betrayal. Professional, systemic, deliberate betrayal. He handed the phone back to his clerk. "Bring me the full transcript from the Briggs case," he said. "Original and redacted versions. If Naomi's right, then that boy didn't just get overlooked. He got erased." The file arrived 20 minutes later. Emerson sat at the long conference table in his chambers. Lights dimmed, his son drawing silently across from him. The folder was thick, aged and bound in red tape, marked "Sealed by order of the court, file 04137, Briggs." He opened it. And there it was. Line after line of courtroom testimony, police statements filled with inconsistencies. No fingerprints, no eyewitness placing Terrence inside the store, only circumstantial evidence from a confidential informant who had since disappeared. But more damning was the internal memo. Barely legible, marked "Private discussion, do not submit," in which the investigating officer expressed doubt. "Surveillance footage is too grainy to ID suspect clearly. Informant unreliable. No physical evidence tied directly to Briggs." Yet none of this had made it into the trial. It had been deemed inadmissible by the court, after a motion filed under expedited conditions with Bradley Whitmore's name signed in pen at the bottom. Emerson sat back in his chair, fingers steepled. He remembered now. Back then, he'd voiced concern. Softly, carefully, told his senior, a partner at the firm, that the evidence felt thin, that the kid didn't seem guilty. The partner had smiled. "Sometimes what seems true isn't useful in court, Langston. Learn to work with what sticks." He had dropped it. Too new, too cautious, too aware of the rules that black men in white spaces were expected to follow. Speak less, prove more. Now, 20 years later, he couldn't stay silent again. He stood, robe sweeping behind him. To his son, he said simply, "Come." They moved through the courthouse with gravity, the kind that shifts rooms even before footsteps are heard. Emerson passed by junior clerks, stunned bailiffs, staff members still absorbing the previous day's headlines. At the courtroom door, he paused. Inside, the lights were still on. A few attorneys from the ethics hearing remained seated, along with Danielle, Malcolm Briggs, and 2 DOJ observers sent for oversight. Emerson stepped in. Danielle stood, eyes full of anticipation. "Judge Langston." He nodded toward the clerk's desk. "Pull up case file 0411137, Briggs. Unseal it. I am now moving to review this trial under federal jurisdiction." The room froze. "You're reopening it?" one of the DOJ agents asked. "I am," Emerson said. "This case was manipulated. Evidence withheld. A life rewritten by procedural misconduct." Bradley, seated in the back now, visibly paled. Malcolm Briggs stood slowly. "My brother died trying to clear his name." Emerson met his eyes. "Then let's give him the justice he was denied." Danielle, fingers swift across the keyboard, loaded the case onto the main screen. One image stood out, a surveillance still from the night of the alleged robbery. A grainy silhouette, tall, hooded, but clearly not Terrence. Different build, different posture. And yet that image had never been presented to the jury. Emerson leaned forward, eyes narrowed. This alone warrants review. But this isn't just about Terrence Briggs, he said. It's about a pattern, and today we make that pattern visible. The courtroom, even half full, held its breath. Emerson turned to the DOJ reps. You'll get full access. I'm opening my chambers to the investigation. Every sealed motion, every backroom deal, every whisper Bradley Whitmore turned into a ruling. Bradley looked like he might speak. But Emerson didn't give him the floor. You've spoken long enough, he said. Now it's time someone else got heard. He turned back to the bench and sat. His son remained just behind him, not on the bench but close, a silent witness to justice reclaimed. Then, from the back of the courtroom, an unfamiliar voice called out, Judge Langston, I was the officer assigned to the Briggs case, and I lied under oath. I'm ready to confess, but it's not just Whitmore. There's more, a lot more. The courthouse had become more than a building. It was now a symbol, a vessel of buried truth finally breaking open, spilling into streets that once turned their backs to such conversations. And the ripple didn't stop at the courtroom walls. It moved outward, unsettling the town that for years had lived in quiet complicity, too comfortable to confront what it had long tolerated. The very next morning, Charleston's local paper ran a front-page headline in bold black print. Federal judge reopens historic case, accuses system of racist sabotage. Within hours, it wasn't just the national media parked outside the courthouse. It was the people, grandmothers in folding chairs, college students holding homemade signs, pastors in Sunday robes, even skeptics who had never trusted the justice system to serve people who looked like them. They didn't come for spectacle. They came because for the first time, they felt seen. Emerson watched from his chamber's window as the crowd grew, gathering in quiet determination beneath banners that read, Truth has a voice, justice for the forgotten, we are the evidence. He stood there in silence, his hands clasped behind him, his son at his side, eyes wide, taking in a view no classroom could teach. Is this what justice looks like? The boy asked softly. Emerson didn't answer right away. It's what the fight for justice looks like, he said. Justice still has a long road to walk. Inside the city's oldest black church, Mount Salem AME, a special service was held that evening. Not for mourning, but for testimony. Reverend Hayes, a man whose voice could rattle rafters and hearts alike, took to the pulpit not to preach, but to witness. We are living through the unburying of truth, he said. Not because a system changed, but because one man refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier. Judge Emerson Langston has not just reopened a case, he's reopened hope, and it's our job now to keep it open. Applause roared from the pews. Victims' families stood to speak. One by one, they told stories once dismissed, of sons misjudged, brothers railroaded, of courtrooms where their voices had never mattered. Some wept, others trembled, but none stayed silent. Even those who had once doubted Emerson's presence on the bench now called his name with reverence. Across town, in schools, teachers rearranged their social studies curriculum overnight. Civics teachers led spontaneous discussions on bias and justice. Students who had once rolled their eyes at lectures now raised their hands to ask, can we write letters to Judge Langston? Churches that had long stayed apolitical began to speak publicly, black and white alike. But what surprised many was who else came forward. White residents, some ashamed, some afraid, some finally ready to acknowledge the silence that made them complicit. A retired juror named Elaine Morrison came forward in tears on a local radio show, admitting she had voted guilty in a case involving a young black teen because he looked too calm, like he didn't care. She didn't realize until years later that she'd mistaken fear for apathy and that her decision had haunted her since. I didn't ask for the full story, she said through sobs. I just let the courtroom tell me what I wanted to hear. Her confession sparked a cascade. More people came forward. Teachers, former court reporters, public defenders. Not everyone had committed an injustice, but many had watched it happen. And now the mirror Emerson had held up reflected more than just one man's sin. It showed the shadow of a town that had accepted a narrow version of justice for far too long. Even Bradley Whitmore's former paralegal, a white woman in her 50s named Tracy Henley, gave an anonymous interview describing how Bradley would often throw out evidence he labeled as emotional baggage. He once told me, the jury doesn't need drama, they need a clean picture of guilt, she recalled. Looking back, I realized what he meant. He didn't want them to see the humanity of his black clients. Her words stung the airwaves like confessionals in a courtroom. Emerson, though grateful for the groundswell, remained cautious. He knew movements could be hijacked. He knew admiration could turn to fear with one wrong step, one headline spun the wrong way. But more than that, he knew resistance was never far behind progress. And it came, quietly, slipped beneath his chamber door one morning on official letterhead but unsigned. A typed note folded twice. You're opening more than old cases. You're opening wounds that this town worked hard to bury. If you don't stop now, someone else will make sure you do. No name, no threats of violence. Just a cold, sterile promise. It wasn't the first time Emerson had felt targeted, but this time, it felt institutional. Not angry, not emotional. Strategic. He held the note up to the light, read it again, and then calmly handed it to his clerk. Scan this, he said, then forward it to the DOJ's internal security team. She blinked. Do you think it's real? I think it's careful, he said, and that makes it real enough. He turned back toward the window. The crowd below hadn't thinned. It had grown. More signs, more candles, more people willing to speak. The movement was now out of his hands. But its spark had started in his courtroom. That meant something. Later that day, Naomi Presley, the investigative reporter who had helped uncover the Briggs evidence, requested a private meeting. She entered his chambers with urgency in her eyes and a manila folder in her hand. This isn't over, she said without preamble. I've traced 6 other cases where Bradley filed motions to seal or suppress crucial testimony, all involving black defendants. But there's one that stands out. She slid the folder across the table. This one was filed under a false name, the defendant listed as John Doe. But the real identity? We think it's Jasmine Miles. Emerson's breath caught. He opened the file slowly. The evidence was damning. A signature similar to Bradley's, doctored timestamps, and a document indicating that Jasmine had tried to appeal her case, but it had been flagged as dismissed for clerical error. That error had cost her 9 months of her life. I think it was intentional, Naomi said, and I think it's just the beginning. Emerson stared at the papers, his reflection mirrored in the surface of the file. He had thought reopening Terrence's case was the worst of it. But now, the real reckoning was beginning. A knock interrupted them. His clerk appeared, breathless. Sir, DOJ agents just arrived. They say they've received a subpoena request, and it's not for Whitmore, it's for you. The courtroom was unusually still for a federal proceeding, not from lack of movement, but from the sheer emotional weight pressing down on every corner of the room. It wasn't the kind of silence born from decorum. It was something deeper. It was the kind of silence that only surfaces when truth sits in the room, uninvited but no longer avoidable. Judge Emerson Langston sat at the bench, posture composed but eyes weary. On the desk before him sat the manila folder Naomi Presley had delivered only an hour earlier, the one connecting Jasmine Miles to a manipulated appeal, hidden under a false identity and buried under procedural jargon. To Emerson, it wasn't just a case, it was memory weaponized. But now another fire was burning in the room. The Department of Justice had authorized a public testimony hearing, allowing past clients of Bradley Whitmore, those who had once been dismissed, rushed, or coerced into silence, to speak. And they came. In waves. The pews of the courtroom filled not with legal observers or firm associates, but with ordinary people, working class, black, brown, men and women who had once sat on the other side of the bench with hope in their eyes and cuffs on their wrists. Now they returned with stories. The first to speak was Andre Holloway, a delivery driver arrested in 2003 for alleged assault after defending himself during a traffic stop. Emerson recognized the case. He had reviewed the transcript last night. Andre stood before the court, fists trembling slightly, his voice steady but strained. I told Whitmore what happened, Andre said. I told him I was hit first, that I didn't fight back until I was shoved. He told me not to bring up the cop's race. Said, you want the jury thinking you're the angry type? I stayed quiet. I did 5 years. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Next came Marissa Cole, a former university student arrested for shoplifting when she accidentally walked out of a bookstore with an unpaid item beneath a stack of folders. I tried to explain, she said through tears. Whitmore didn't care. He said the jury would never believe an educated black girl forgot to pay. I was suspended for 2 semesters. It took me 5 years to finish my degree. And then came Isaac Boone, who didn't speak for the first full minute. He just stood there, staring at Whitmore, who now sat behind the defense table like a ghost of his former self. Face pale, collar unbuttoned, eyes empty. You called me boy, Isaac finally said, in front of the jury, pretended it was part of some legal phrase, but I saw the smirk. I heard the laughter from the gallery. Emerson listened to each word. But inside him, war was brewing. Every testimony struck deeper than the last. Every sentence unearthed more of the system's rot. Yet with every story, Emerson felt the edge of something else, something dark pressing against the walls of his chest, bitterness. He tried to push it down, but it lingered. Because he had been there too. In their stories, he heard himself. In their silences, he recognized his own. He had walked into courtrooms where the defense didn't look up until he introduced himself, where juries watched him more closely than his argument, where judges second-guessed every word he said, not for legality, but for tone. And now, those ghosts filled his gallery. But not all the ghosts came from the defense side. One of them sat quietly on the second bench, dressed in a muted gray suit, hair white, eyes restless. Judge William Holden. The very man who once presided over Bradley's trials. The same judge who had first attempted to override Emerson's presence when he walked into the courtroom that fateful morning. Now he sat silently, like a witness too late to change the verdict. Emerson saw him, and chose not to look away. Midway through the hearing, the DOJ official stood. Will now allow testimonies from non-defendant affiliates, including jurors if willing. A hush fell. Then a slow creak. From the back of the gallery, an older white woman stood, early 70s, purse clutched tight, face pale with resolve. Her name was Helen Motley, a retired librarian. She walked with a cane, and the careful pace of someone bearing more than just age. She took the stand. I served as a juror in the People v. Tyler Jameson case, she said. 15 years ago. Young black boy, accused of armed robbery. Her voice quivered. We found him guilty, but not all of us were sure. A pause. The deliberations, they were fast. Some jurors said things like, "Look at him, he fits the part, and you really think he didn't do it?" I said nothing. She looked directly at Emerson. I wanted to, I didn't. Tears formed in the corners of her eyes. But today, I say it under oath, my silence was racial bias. I didn't stand up because I didn't want to be the only one who doubted. I let a boy go to prison because I was afraid of looking soft. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Whitmore raised his head slightly. Helen finished. That conviction ruined him. I saw him 2 years ago on the street, panhandling. I walked past. Now I can't. She stepped down, trembling, but upright. Emerson's chest tightened. This was more than a case now. This was reckoning, lived and confessed. As the testimonies concluded, Emerson glanced toward the gallery once more. The people who had once been statistics, names in court files, now sat as living proof of systemic harm. His hands gripped the bench, not from anger, but from restraint. The bitterness had shifted now. It had transmuted into clarity. He saw that justice wasn't just about verdicts. It was about witnessing, about holding space for stories too long dismissed. Emerson exhaled deeply, then stood. This hearing, he said slowly, has not just uncovered misconduct. It has revealed a pattern of bias, manipulation, and silence woven deep into the practice of law. He looked to the gallery. To all who spoke, your stories were not wasted. They will be entered into the permanent record, and they will not be ignored again. He turned toward the DOJ. We begin disciplinary and criminal review proceedings against all named parties, effective immediately. The gallery erupted in murmurs, this time filled not with tension, but stunned gratitude. And just as Emerson moved to adjourn, the door opened sharply. A court officer stepped in, holding a sealed envelope. The courtroom hadn't emptied since the last hearing. It had only grown tighter with anticipation. News cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop the silence from feeling recorded. Every breath, every shift of fabric, every cough from the back row sounded louder than normal, like the room itself was listening. At the center of it all sat Judge Emerson Langston, robe crisp, expression unreadable, but eyes flickering with the unmistakable weight of a man on the edge of something irreversible. On the table before him lay the sealed envelope, unopened but scorching with implication. A formal ethics complaint. Filed not by a political rival, not by Bradley Whitmore, not even by a disgruntled juror, but by Emerson's former law school mentor, Judge Philip Carradine, a man Emerson had once admired. Trusted. A man who taught him to read between the lines, to lead with law, not emotion. The envelope rested there like a ghost. The courtroom waited. On the floor below, both the DOJ representative and Bradley's newly assigned defense counsel were finishing their closing remarks. A procedural formality, yes, but one charged with history, tone, and public consequence. The DOJ attorney, a woman named Tessa Monroe, stood tall and unapologetic. We're not just here because of one man's ego, she said, glancing toward Whitmore without naming him. We're here because a structure allowed him to operate unchecked, for years. This is about accountability, not vengeance. Bradley's defense tried a different tact. His lawyer, carefully chosen by the firm to look neutral, young, biracial, Harvard credentials, spoke softly. Yes, my client failed. Yes, his record is stained. But his misconduct existed inside a larger courtroom culture that enabled those choices. If we crucify the man and ignore the system, we miss the real target. Emerson listened to every word. But it wasn't the legal arguments that echoed loudest. It was the shifting silence that followed. He looked up toward the gallery. There, seated in the second row, was his son. Eyes wide, back straight. The boy hadn't missed a single day. He had watched his father preside, interrogate, listen, unravel truths, and now he was watching something else, something heavier. A moment where justice wasn't about punishment. It was about direction. Emerson inhaled deeply and remembered. The flashback came not as a blur, but as a sharp, vivid moment, one he had never spoken aloud, not even in the journal tucked inside his bottom drawer. He was 13, standing in the living room. His father sat near the window, oxygen tank hissing quietly beside him. Skin pale, breath shallow. It was the last conversation they ever had. People think dignity's about how you hold your chin, his father had said, but it's about how you hold your ground when your hands are tied. Emerson hadn't understood then. He did now. Because here, in this courtroom, with the world waiting, his hands were tied, not by law, but by expectation. The people expected a ruling that scorched the earth. That humiliated Whitmore. That made headlines scream with revenge served hot. But justice wasn't always theatrical. Sometimes it was colder, sharper. He reached for the envelope and opened it. Inside, a typed memo, signed by Judge Carradine. It alleged that Emerson, in the Jasmine Miles case, had failed to escalate his concerns about legal irregularities, and that by continuing to work for a firm that suppressed evidence, he had allowed a miscarriage of justice to proceed. It was phrased professionally. But Emerson read the subtext clearly. You knew. You didn't fight hard enough. That's on you too. He didn't flinch. Because he agreed. He had tried to raise flags. Quietly. Carefully. But he hadn't pushed. He hadn't fought the way he could have. He'd let fear dictate tone. And that made him part of the silence. He folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tapped the gavel. Stand, he said softly. Everyone rose. I've reviewed the arguments, Emerson began, voice even. I've listened to the victims, examined the evidence, and reflected on my own silence in past decisions. He looked to the crowd. No teleprompter. No notes. I won't pretend to be impartial. This isn't a case that calls for it. This is a reckoning. And reckoning demands honesty. All eyes were on him. I have 2 rulings to issue, he said. The first, Bradley Whitmore, is found guilty of legal misconduct, evidence suppression, and racially biased prosecutorial behavior. His license to practice law in this state is hereby revoked, effective immediately. The DOJ may proceed with criminal review. There were no cheers. Just collective release. The sound of tension exhaled. Emerson continued. The second ruling is less conventional, but necessary. He paused. Judge Philip Carradine's ethics complaint has merit. I did not do enough to protect Jasmine Miles. I raised concerns, but I did not scream. I feared for my career. And in that fear I betrayed the very integrity I now ask others to uphold. Gasps swept through the courtroom. His son leaned forward, concern flashing across his young face. Emerson looked at him. Then smiled. Not with joy, but peace. I hereby place myself under voluntary internal review. I have requested that a panel of independent justices examine my conduct from that case. If found negligent, I will accept suspension. The room was stunned. Even the DOJ attorney looked surprised. He wasn't finished. But I will not step down. Because this bench does not need another man who fears exposure. It needs one who knows what silence costs, and will never allow it again. He picked up the gavel, raised it slowly, then stopped, and looked directly at Bradley Whitmore. For years, Emerson said, you believed power meant never answering to those beneath you. Today you're not beneath me, you're beside me, in this shared shame. He struck the gavel once. Court adjourned. But just as the room began to react, a federal marshal rushed forward, whispering something urgent into the DOJ rep's ear. She turned pale, and then turned to Emerson. Sir, Jasmine Miles is alive, and she's been watching. She just walked into the lobby downstairs, and she wants to speak to you. Privately. The lobby of the courthouse had never felt sacred before. It was all polished tile and bureaucratic lighting, the kind of place where attorneys checked their phones and clerks shuffled papers. But that afternoon, as Emerson Langston stepped through the double doors with the weight of the courtroom still trailing behind him, the space felt transformed. And waiting in the center of it was Jasmine Miles. She stood tall, not like a victim, but like a woman who had learned to build her spine from every stone thrown at her. Her hair was natural, pulled back in a clean twist. She wore no makeup, no mask. Her eyes were steady, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, not trembling, just expectant. Emerson paused a few feet away. He had imagined this moment 100 ways. Each time, he was the one who spoke first. Apologized, explained. But now, with her right there, all of it vanished. It was Jasmine who spoke. "I didn't come here for closure," she said. "I've lived, built a business, raised a son. I came here to see if you'd say it, really say it." Emerson nodded slowly, then took a step forward. "I failed you," he said. "I was young. I was quiet. I convinced myself that raising a flag without waving it would be enough. But silence is a choice too." Jasmine tilted her head, assessing him. Then her lips parted in the faintest trace of a smile. "You're not who you were," she said. "Neither am I. That's the difference between punishment and justice. One locks people down, the other opens them up." She extended her hand. He took it, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a contract between two survivors who knew the law had always been too small for their kind of truth. The ruling on Bradley Whitmore's future came days later. No handcuffs, no orange jumpsuit, but not a reprieve either. Federal prosecutors, working in conjunction with the DOJ Ethics Board, sentenced Bradley to 5 years of probation with mandatory civil service. His assignment, a rotating legal aid position in underserved black communities, supervised by oversight boards comprised of former clients and community leaders. Some called it a slap on the wrist. Others, especially those who had once sat across from him in court, saw it differently. "This is the first time he'll have to listen," said Andre Holloway, the former delivery driver. "Not speak, just listen. That's harder than jail for a man like him." Bradley said little at the press conference that followed. He looked thinner, defeated, but not broken. Perhaps for the first time, simply aware. Emerson, meanwhile, wasted no time. Within a month, he officially launched the Judicial Equity Program, a first-of-its-kind initiative designed to identify, audit, and reform courtroom disparities at the local level. It included mandatory racial bias training for all public defenders and prosecutors, anonymous reporting systems for defendants who felt targeted, and a restorative justice division tasked with facilitating direct dialogues between wrongfully convicted individuals and the attorneys or judges involved in their cases. The program, funded by a coalition of private donors and federal grants, began in Charleston but soon expanded across the Southeast. And it wasn't just symbolic. The reforms had teeth. Within 6 months, 5 convictions had been overturned, 3 attorneys sanctioned, and 1 judge removed from the bench for discriminatory practices. Victims like Jasmine were offered reparations, not just financial, but structural. Free legal aid for life. Scholarships for their children. Public acknowledgement of the harm done. For some, it still wasn't enough. But for others, it was the beginning of a healing no courtroom had ever offered them before. National attention followed. News outlets covered the wave of reform with cautious optimism. Headlines ran, "Langston's Law. Can dignity be legislated? From silence to system, the judge who changed the game. Justice beyond the bench." He was invited to speak at universities, legal summits, even the White House. But Emerson rarely accepted. He kept his focus on the program, on the files still crossing his desk, on the defendants who still needed someone to see them. His son, now shadowing him after school like a quiet apprentice, once asked him why he declined so many awards. Emerson had simply said, "I didn't do it for applause. I did it because I couldn't live with the silence anymore." And his son nodded, because he understood. Still, some honors arrived without his consent. One morning, he walked into the courthouse and saw a brass plaque being drilled into the stone wall by the front entrance. Emerson Langston Justice Hall. He sighed. A small smile tugged at his mouth, just briefly. Then he walked past it, into another day of duty. But even justice reimagined must make room for grief. Late one Sunday afternoon, Emerson drove alone, miles outside Charleston, to a cemetery shaded by moss-draped oaks. There was no press, no cameras, no audience. Just him. And a simple gravestone that read, "Terrence A. Briggs, 1988, 2020. They heard me late, but they heard me. Upsef Budomore." He stood there for a long while, the wind brushing gently across the grass. Then, from the pocket of his coat, he pulled a letter. folded, handwritten. He read it aloud to no one, and to someone. Terrence, I never forgot your face, or your silence, or the way the system made it feel like both were a threat. I came late, but I came. And I'm still here. We are still here. Thank you for trusting someone would listen. I promise I'm still listening. He placed the letter beneath a small stone at the base of the headstone, weighed it down, then stood once more. And just as he turned to leave, cliffhanger, a child's voice called out from behind him. Mr. Langston? He turned. A teenage boy stood at the gate. Dark skin. Familiar eyes. A notebook in hand. I'm Terrence's nephew, he said. I heard what you did. I think I want to be a lawyer too. The road leading into South Orangeburg hadn't changed much. The cracked sidewalks were still uneven. The rusted street signs still leaned slightly left, and the corner store Emerson used to sneak candy from was now a boarded-up shell. But time hadn't worn this place down. Memory had. And today, Emerson had brought his son here not for nostalgia, but for truth. They pulled up in front of a small single-story house with peeling white paint and green shutters that had once been vibrant. The lawn was patchy but familiar. Emerson stepped out of the car slowly, the soles of his polished shoes crunching against the gravel driveway. His son followed, eyes wide, camera phone tucked in his hoodie but untouched. This where you grew up? The boy asked. Emerson nodded. Every scraped knee, every report card, every lesson I didn't know I was learning. It all started here. The boy looked around, unsure what he was supposed to feel. It's small. It was enough, Emerson replied. But the space around us didn't always feel like ours. He motioned toward the corner, a crooked intersection just 2 blocks away. That street right there, he said quietly. I wasn't allowed to walk down it, not because of any law, but because my mother knew what might happen if I did. His son turned toward the street, confused. Why? Because the man on the corner, Mr. Blanchard, called the police every time a black boy passed his driveway, Emerson said. Didn't matter if you had a backpack or a basketball. That's where loitering started to mean existing while black. The words hung between them like wind chimes in still air. The boy said nothing. And that silence, that space where a lesson takes root, was all Emerson needed. He walked them toward the porch. This step here, he added, tapping the concrete with his shoe. This is where I sat during my first protest. His son raised a brow. On your porch? It started here, Emerson smiled. They wouldn't let us gather downtown, so we stayed here, me and 6 others. We made signs, wrote letters, practiced chants we never got to yell because our teachers threatened suspension. He pointed toward the front door. My mom told me that if I was going to protest, I'd better be ready to lose something, because nothing worth having comes without cost. The boy was quiet again. But something in his eyes had shifted. He wasn't just absorbing stories now. He was studying them, gripping them like tools he didn't yet know how to use. They stood on the porch for several minutes, saying little, watching the wind pass through trees that had once been shorter, younger, more dangerous. Then, as they turned to leave, Emerson's son asked, "Did you ever walk down that street anyway?" Emerson paused. A small grin tugged at his cheek. "Only once," he said. "The night I got accepted into Howard. I walked the whole block slow, every step like it was mine." Mr. Blanchard stared through the blinds the whole time, never called anyone. His son smiled now too. It was quiet, but it was deep. Later that evening, back at their Charleston home, the boy sat in his room with the door half open, pen in hand, notebook spread across his lap. Emerson passed by, pausing just briefly to look in, not intrusively, just enough to see the shape of focus forming. "Homework?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "Kind of." "Need help?" The boy didn't look up. Not this time. Emerson nodded and kept walking, retreating into his study. But something about the moment stayed with him, the stillness of it, the sense that something inside his son had shifted without fanfare. That night, as Emerson returned to check in, he found the notebook left on the kitchen table. The boy had gone to bed. On the first page, scrawled in neat block letters, was a title, "Why I Want to Wear the Robe," and beneath it, a speech, half-finished, raw, but burning with purpose.
My dad never taught me with shouting.
He taught me with silence. He showed me a street he couldn't walk on, and then walked me through it anyway. He didn't make justice look easy. He made it look worth it. I want to be a judge. Because I want to make the courtroom bigger. Big enough for stories like his. And big enough for boys like me. Emerson stood at the kitchen counter, eyes locked on the page, heart beating slowly, not with fear or grief or anger, but with something that felt almost foreign after so much loss: hope. This wasn't a headline. This wasn't a ruling.
This was legacy.
Not inherited, but earned. And just as he folded the notebook, ready to leave it untouched for his son to reclaim in the morning, his phone buzzed. A message. From his clerk. Judge Langston, urgent. DOJ just confirmed. A former juvenile case from your early legal years has surfaced. The defendant was 17 and wrongfully sentenced. Turns out he's still alive. He's trying to reach you. Emerson stood frozen. The name flashed across the message. Devin Pierce. Emerson looked toward the hallway where his son now slept, and knew the past wasn't done calling. But maybe this time, he would be ready to answer. The courtroom hadn't changed much in decor, but its energy had shifted forever. The walls still wore the same muted tones. The bench still rose above the gallery with quiet authority, and the echo of each gavel strike still reached the corners like a slow heartbeat. But now, every creak of a pew, every shuffle of paper, every murmur between proceedings carried something different: memory. Judge Emerson Langston had announced his retirement 6 weeks earlier. Not because of scandal, not from pressure, but from purpose. He had decided that his greatest contribution wouldn't be from the bench, it would be from the front of a classroom. He had seen what silence did in courtrooms. Now he would teach others how to speak. His farewell proceedings were private, per his request. No televised coverage, no elaborate send-off, just a gathering of law clerks, former clients, prosecutors, victims, and his son, now taller, sharper, and days away from starting at Howard Law with full honors and 2 prestigious scholarships, one of which bore his father's name. The room buzzed with quiet reverence. Emerson stood behind the podium in the same courtroom where the fire had started, the day he'd walked in quietly, sat in the gallery, and been mistaken for someone invisible. Now, every eye waited for his words. He didn't bring notes. He never had. "I've spent my life," he began, "waiting to be heard. And when I finally was, I learned that the louder your title, the more softly you need to speak." He paused, looked at the rows of faces, white, black, old, young, people who once feared the system, now learning to help repair it. "I won't pretend we've solved anything," he said. "Racism didn't retire when I raised my gavel. It recalibrated. It finds new robes, new codes, new ways to say you don't belong here." He turned to his son, seated front row. "But we fight anyway. Not because we believe we'll win today, but because we want our children to inherit a battlefield with fewer landmines." The room stilled. "Resilience," he continued, "isn't just enduring pain, it's refusing to pass it on." Applause rose, not thunderous, but intentional, like a verdict. Outside, the city had changed too. The judicial equity program now had chapters in 12 states. Black law students in Charleston could apply for Langston Fellowships, full-ride scholarships funded by grants, and the restitution settlements from wrongfully prosecuted cases Emerson had helped reopen. One of the original victims, Jasmine Miles, now co-chaired the Reconciliation Board. She often said, "Emerson didn't free us. He gave us the tools to free ourselves." On his last day at the courthouse, Emerson arrived early, as he always did. The building was quiet, humming with the kind of melancholy that comes when a foundation shifts and everyone feels it. He carried nothing but a small leather briefcase, and the original law book his son had once clutched in that first courtroom moment. Its edges frayed, its cover faded, its weight still profound. The bailiff nodded respectfully. "Judge," he said, "it won't be the same without you." Emerson smiled. "Good. It shouldn't be." He made one last pass through the hallways, peered into courtrooms, saw younger judges presiding, heard clerks citing reforms he'd helped implement, saw young black interns walking confidently, no longer mistaken for defendants. He stood for a moment in front of his own portrait, recently unveiled. Not grandiose, not gilded. Just him. No gavel raised, just standing, watching, as if listening. By noon, his chambers were empty. Books packed, desk cleared, memories sealed gently into each wall. But before leaving, he sat one last time at the bench, placed his hand gently on the polished wood, closed his eyes, and let silence return. Not the old silence, filled with fear and erasure, but a new one, full of peace. As he stood to leave, footsteps echoed behind him. He turned. A young black man had entered the courtroom, briefcase in hand, posture straight, suit well-tailored but modest. He paused when he saw Emerson. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," the man said. Emerson shook his head. "You're not. First day?" The man smiled. "Yeah. Clerkship. Langston Fellowship recipient. I watched you my whole senior year. Your ruling in the Briggs case, it made me apply. Emerson's gaze softened. What's your name? He asked. The young man stepped forward. Devin Pierce, Jr., he said, named after my father. Emerson blinked. A pulse of recognition struck deep. Devin Pierce. The same name that had been whispered in that message weeks ago. The juvenile defendant who had been wrongfully sentenced. The one who had reached out, and whose name had ignited a buried fear in Emerson's heart. But this wasn't the father. It was the son. Standing here. Alive. Determined. History staring back at him. I wanted to find you, Devin Jr. said. To tell you my father forgave what happened. He just wanted to make sure I never saw a courtroom the way he did. And thanks to what you built, I won't. Emerson nodded slowly, words caught behind emotion. Then, he said at last, you're exactly where you belong. Devin smiled. As he turned to walk toward the clerk's table, Emerson stood still. One last look at the gallery, at the bench, at the place where insult once met transformation. And as the doors began to close behind him, Emerson heard a familiar voice, faint, imagined, or maybe real. His father's voice. You held your ground, son, even with your hands tied. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect, feel, or see injustice with new eyes, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel for more untold stories that challenge silence, confront racism, and honor the voices history tried to erase. Your like, comment, and share help these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most, in classrooms, in homes, in courtrooms, still waiting to change. Because stories like this aren't